Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really powerful series of warnings from the ancient prophet Isaiah. We're going to walk through chapter 5 and get right into the thick of the judgments he lays out in verses 8 through 17. Okay, let's jump right in. Isaiah kicks things off with the first of several woes. Now, a woe isn't just, an expression of sadness. Think of it more like a formal announcement of impending disaster, a judgment aimed at very specific sins. And this first one, right here in verse 8, has the wealthy elite squarely in its sight. So this first woe is all about greed or avarice. Isaiah is calling out the powerful for basically creating a monopoly on land, snapping up every house, every field, until they were the only ones left standing. What you end up with is a society of super rich landlords and a whole class of people left with absolutely nothing. And to really get how serious this was, you have to understand the culture. This wasn't just some shrewd business strategy. Under the law of Moses, land was sacred. It was an inheritance from God, and it was meant to stay in a family forever. So this land-grabbing frenzy wasn't just unethical. It was a direct violation of God's law, kicking families off the land they'd had for generations. And what's really wild is how this pattern just seems to repeat itself over and over. The source material points to a fascinating parallel from the 1830s in Kirtland, Ohio. You had a very similar situation, speculative land buying that sent prices through the roof and created huge economic problems. It's just a powerful reminder that this warning against unchecked greed is absolutely timeless. So what's the ultimate price for all this greed? Well, verse 9 spells it out, and it's pretty blunt. Desolation. The very houses and fields they were so desperate to own would end up completely empty. They'd become these grand, beautiful, but totally worthless monuments to their own greed, with no one left to live in them. And the judgment doesn't just stop with empty houses. Oh no. Verse 10 tells us the land itself is going to be cursed. It'll become barren, unable to produce crops. And this is kind of a double whammy. It's partly a divine curse, sure, but it's also practical. The people who actually knew how to farm the land have all been driven away or captured. Now, to really appreciate the scale of this agricultural disaster, you gotta understand the terms Isaiah is using. Verse 10 says that 10 acres of prime vineyard will produce only 1 bath of wine. A bath is about 7.5 gallons. Now, to put that in perspective for you, a healthy vineyard that size should produce something like 500 baths. So this is a total collapse. He does the same thing with grain, using a couple of other measurements. He says the seed of a homer, which was a huge amount of seed, a major investment to plant, will only yield an ephah. And an ephah? Well, that's just a tiny fraction of a homer, only 1/10 to be exact. So let's do the math here. It's absolutely brutal. You plant a massive amount of seed, and you get back only 10% of what you put in. That's a 90% loss. This isn't just a bad harvest, it's a catastrophic failure, showing how the very land they craved would end up betraying them completely. Okay, so let's move on to the second woe in verses 11 and 12. You can really see how Isaiah is building his case here. He pivots from the sin of hoarding stuff to the sin of just total indulgence and distraction. In this part, Isaiah just lays into the ruling class for their lifestyle of non-stop partying. I mean, these are people waking up early just so they can start drinking, and they keep it going all night with feasts and music. They're so wrapped up in their own pleasure that they've become completely disconnected from reality, and, more importantly, from God. You know the old saying about fiddling while Rome burns? That is exactly what's happening here. They're so preoccupied with their own little world of wine and parties that they don't even see the work of the Lord, which, in this context, is the giant storm of judgment that Isaiah is screaming at them about. They're just completely blind to the crisis that's about to crash down on them. So you've got this 1-2 punch of sins, massive greed on one hand and willful, blissful ignorance on the other. And for that, Isaiah makes it crystal clear that judgment isn't just a possibility. Nope, it is an absolute certainty. In fact, the sentence has already been passed. And listen to the language he uses in verse 13. He speaks in the past tense. My people are gone into captivity. He does that to just hammer home how certain this is. It's a done deal. And the consequences are stark. Their best and brightest will starve, and the general population will be racked with thirst. The imagery here in verse 14 is, wow, it is something else. Hell, or maybe better understood as the grave or death itself, is pictured like this giant monster with a bottomless stomach, just opening its mouth as wide as it can to swallow the wicked leaders of Judah whole. And what's on the menu for this monster? Their glory, their multitude, their pomp. In other words, every single symbol of their arrogant, worldly success. Everything they built their pride on is headed straight for destruction, about to be consumed by starvation and the armies of Babylon. So what comes after all this fiery destruction? Well, what follows is a complete flipping of the script, a total upending of the social order. It's a great and powerful humbling for the very people who thought they were completely untouchable. Just as verses 15 and 16 say, everyone gets brought down a peg, from the average person, the mean man, to the powerful leader, the mighty man. All that pride gets shattered. But here's the twist. Through this very act of judgment, God is lifted up. His justice and his holiness are put on full display for everyone to see. So that leaves one last big question. What happens to all that land? Those huge empty estates that the wealthy hoarded? Well, verse 17 gives us a couple of different ways we can interpret what happens next. All right, so there are two main takes on this. The first interpretation is that the lands just become open pasture and foreign invaders sweep in and take whatever's left. The second, and maybe more hopeful view, is that the lambs, which is seen as the poor and righteous people who are left behind, actually get to inherit the empty estates of the rich who are exiled. But honestly, either way you slice it, the main point is the same. The land is taken away from those who stole it. Isaiah's prophecy is just this stark warning from thousands of years ago, and it really leaves us with this heavy, timeless question. It shows us that the consequences of greed and ignoring the truth don't just stay with the guilty. They create this destructive ripple effect that can tear through an entire society, leaving nothing but ruin behind.